Welcome to the introduction of the Iowa Cow-Calf Production Program called the Iowa Cow-Calf Systems Project for short. I'm Denise Schwab, Extension Beef Specialist for Northeast Iowa, and I'm going to give you a little overview of the project as well as the first unit on production cost. So to let you know that the program has been funded by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. It was a 3-year project where our objective was to look at 3 different types of cow production systems and try to document cost of production as well as best management practices. Our 3 systems were traditional, which would be basically grazing half of the year and feeding stored feed half of the year, about. Extended grazing systems where we're basically grazing for at least 9 months out of the year or more. And then the limit grazing systems where we're delivering feed to the cow for the majority of the herd, maybe limited grazing on pasture, but less than a couple months. To give you an overview of the project, we designed it so that we could identify production costs, environmental impacts, and best practices. We had 28 producers who cooperated with us on this project in one way or another. The data includes cost of production records, forage quality and feed testing, ration analysis, and soil sampling. And then we also developed some example budgets and decision tools as a part of the project as well. We feel that this project is important as we look at our current industry. And on this graph, you can see the blue bars are the number of pasture acres that we have lost in the state of Iowa in the last 30 years. The red bar, or the red line, is really the number of beef cows, and you can see that that has decreased as well, but at a much slower rate. So we're running more cows on fewer acres. We're not alone in this situation as we look at the states around us, Iowa and Missouri, in terms of looking at cropland pasture. And in the last 30 years, we've both all seen roughly an 80% loss in pasture acres. The beef industry is important in Iowa, and we have a lot to contribute to the industry. Iowa has an abundant feed source. Our land is very highly productive and has the ability to produce a lot of feed. And for the most part, we feed a very high quality grading cattle. But we also have the challenges of access to land, the ability of new and young producers to enter the business, environmental regulations, and profitability. And if we look at this table from the Livestock Market Information Center, this is looking at returns to the cow herd above cash costs. And with the exception of 2014 and 2015, which were exceptional years, for the most part, we bounce around between a $100 loss and a $100 profit. So probably about a $50 per year return over cash costs per cow across the state. So our first part of this project was to look at production costs, and I'll give you just a brief overview of that. We had 24 cooperators that kept production records over the years 2015, 16, and 17. Most of those kept records all 3 years, a few of them only 1 or 2 years. So we ended up with 62 herd year records that we analyzed, combined and analyzed. Of those records, 21 were from limited grazing programs, 28 were from the traditional system, and 13 were extended grazers. We first looked at feed costs, as that's from every set of data, that's always our biggest cost of production. And we broke that up into stored feed, pasture costs, and residue cost. And we can see here the total feed cost for all of the records in our system was $430 per cow, with about 3/4 of that being stored feed and about 1/4 of it being pasture cost. But what we want to point out is the range of that cost. We had one producer that was as low as $167 of feed cost per cow per year, probably an operation where the pasture was paid for long in advance, very conservative on their stored feed costs and usage, and really doing a great job of grazing. But we also had a high of $955 a cow, which it is very high just for feed costs alone. If we look at the differences between systems, our limited grazers tended to have the highest total feed cost, the majority of that being stored feed, of course. Our traditional grazers were kind of intermediate at $378 per cow, and a split about 1/3 pasture costs and 2/3 grazing costs. And then our extended grazers had the lowest cost on average of all the three systems. But again, a huge range within each of those types of production systems. When we look at production costs beyond feed, we lumped all of our non-feed operating costs into one category here to be able to show you at $254 per cow, but again a range from $118 to $744. Our ownership costs were $286 per cow, and I'll show you more about that in a minute. Unpaid family labor was $116 a cow, and that is based on, again, that's unpaid labor at $14 an hour, for a total cost of production of $1,000.95 per cow, including all of our costs, both cash and non-cash. But again, look at the huge range, $600 to $2,300. When we look across systems, our limited grazers were the highest at $1,350 per cow. Our traditional grazers were intermediate at $984, and our extended grazers were our lowest cost at $869. Again, a large range there, but not as quite as significant as some of the other categories. We wanted to know if our data was realistic looking at other industry benchmarks, so we pulled a few of those together. The first column here is our project, the ISU Cow Systems project. The second column is a few of the operators that are still doing the SPA records for 2012 to 17. We looked at Illinois Farm Business, the FinBin Minnesota program, which includes a number of herds from the upper Midwest, North Dakota's Farm Business, Kansas Farm Management, and then the Southwest SPA, which would be Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. And as we looked at those operations, just looking at feed cost, our average was $306, but looking across the others, we see a low of $250 and a high of $392. So we're right in the middle of that range. Pasture costs, we were at $117, and again, we're kind of in the middle or maybe a little on the lower side of that range of the other benchmark databases. When we look at total feed plus pasture, we were at $423, which again is in the middle from the range of $382 to $538. And then our direct costs, which would be all of our cash costs essentially, we were at $684, and again in the middle of the range of the others. So looking at some of the comparison to our other record keeping systems, we felt our data was very realistic in the range of what the other states are seeing, and showing that our group of producers is very competitive with many of the other producers in surrounding states. Putting the total direct costs on a pie chart to kind of make things a little more visible, and this would be for all operations, but basically stored feed, pasture, and residue grazing makes up about 49% of our total cost of production, so roughly half of that cost, and that tends to be consistent across a lot of records. Our second biggest cash cost was paid labor, which was 12% on average, and then following that would be our pasture expenses, veterinary medicine, and miscellaneous. But you see a number of our expenses there are very small, single digit on a percentage standpoint, and that's the reason we spend so much time talking about feed. And you can listen to the feed section that Erica Lundy is going to present. They'll get into more detail in terms of our feed costs. We then looked at our non-feed operating costs, so this would be all the cash costs other than feed. And what we saw was an average of $253 for all the groups. We ranged from $216 for our extended grazers and $274 for our traditional grazers. So not a huge amount of variation here. But in terms of what expenses were the largest for non-feed, we saw some differences by group. So for our limited grazers and our traditional grazers, contract hired labor or hired labor tended to be our second largest expense behind feed, and for our extended grazers, our second largest cost was veterinary medicine. We did see some differences and some range across the systems on veterinary medicine. We think it is probably more just how people accounted for different input costs, but we did not have the opportunity to look into that any further in this project. We then wanted to look and see some differences by herd size, and so in this table the first column is our average of all of our 62 records. The average herd size in our database was 196 cows, so we basically looked at the smallest half of the producers at 200 cows or less, and our larger group at 200 cows or more. We did see some differences in terms of stored feed cost. Not sure exactly on the detail of that, but assuming it's because our larger operators are able to buy feed in larger quantities, maybe get better discounts in terms of purchase feed. Pasture costs tended to be a little bit smaller, not a huge difference there. Ended up with about an $80 difference on total feed costs between the small cow herds and the large cow herds. We did not have enough numbers to go into very small operations, those in that 40 cow and under, but would anticipate, just looking at the data in general, that we saw more differences on those very small herds than we did even comparing the 200 cows and less herds. We also wanted to see if we saw any differences in terms of the northern half of the state, which we called the Corn Belt region, basically north of Interstate 80, and the grassland region south of Interstate 80, which tends to be more pasture oriented. We did see the Corn Belt obviously had a little more stored feed costs, fed more, but had a higher expense as well. But pasture costs were higher on the grassland because of increased acres. Our Corn Belt region averaged just about 2 acres per cow. Our grassland averaged about 4 acres of pasture per cow. But when you look down at total feed costs, basically no difference at $429 or $431. So basically feed costs on total was pretty equal between the northern half of the state and the southern half of the state. Now to talk a little bit more about how we did our ownership cost. We asked producers to put a value on their female herd, so the cows, the bred heifers, their bulls. Also to put a value on machinery that's used in the cow herd, kind of an actual market value for today, and what percent of the time that machine is used for the cow herd. And then the same with buildings. What's the current market value? What percent of that time is it used for cow herds? We then put that on an annual cost. We use 10% ownership on the cows. So assuming cows turn over about 10% per year, or a 10-year lifespan. Machinery we also did on a 10-year span, assuming we would turn that machine over about every 10 years. And then buildings was 7%. So you can see on this table, on average, our cow ownership costs, which would include depreciation, interest, insurance, those dirty 5 categories on ownership. Cows were running about $176 per year, machinery about $69 per year per cow, and buildings about $41. When we look at our different systems, obviously our limited grazers are going to be the higher end on the machinery and equipment and facilities. They also tended to be a little bit higher on cow ownership costs. They valued their cows at a higher price, but many of our limit grazers were also value added operations. So they might be producing club calves, they might be producing seed stock, maybe they were doing an embryo transfer program with another producer. So they tended to have a little higher cow value. Our traditional and extended grazers are very similar both in cow value, machinery, and buildings. When we looked at the differences by herd size, again, our smaller cows herds tended to have a little higher value, also a little higher machinery and building value. Some of that is probably just the similar value and similar requirements of machinery, just divided by fewer number of cows. We did ask our cooperators to record the amount of labor they spent 3 or 4 weeks throughout the year and then extrapolate it across the year. We came up with an average of 10 hours of labor per cow per year for all of our groups combined. If you look at our enterprise budgets for livestock, we are estimating 8 hours. So our project would say we need to increase that just a little. We saw a little variation between systems, but not an extensive amount. We did see more variation when we looked at cow herd size. The smaller cow herds takes about the same amount of time to check and manage and operate 100 cows as it does 200 cows. And so we saw that here. We also had a few interesting comments about, well, I probably could have done it in a little less time, but I just enjoy spending time with the cattle. So just to give you a ballpark of what we're looking at. We also wanted to replicate what a number of other enterprise record systems do, where they look at the low-cost producers and the high-cost producers and where the differences lie. So we looked at our low-cost one-third producers and our high-third producers. We did see a pretty varied range in terms of feed costs, $159 per cow for stored feed on the low-cost producers and $507 for our high-cost producers. Pasture, we saw a little variation from $123 to $106, for a difference in total cost of $288 per cow for our low-cost producers and $618 for our high-cost third producers. So a huge part of our cost of production differences lies right there in feed cost alone. In terms of our non-feed operating costs, again, those low-cost producers were a little bit lower than our high-cost producers. Our ownership costs, unpaid labor, all was consistent in that our low-cost third was always a little bit more conservative, probably more of a control cost mentality of producers using up machinery, not buying new machinery, equipment, etc. Total cost in our low-cost producers was $808 per cow, and total cost or average cost on our high third producers was $1,484 per cow. So again, very huge range between our low-cost producers and high-cost. We did want to look a little bit at the issue of, are they just pricing their feed lower or higher, and what impact that makes. So we did do a little work. We looked at their total feed usage and put it in at a standard feed cost, and you can see that's in our third and fifth column on this table. If we looked at a standardized feed cost, we saw a difference between $159 or $170 per cow per year, feed variation, and a little bit difference on pasture as well. So the low-cost producers were either valuing their feed at a little less, or were actually producing it at a lower cost. When we look at our high-cost producers, they were actually either valuing their feed a little higher, or it was costing them more to produce that feed. We didn't go into further detail on that. We felt that for the most part there wasn't a huge variation, so we continued to just use the producer's feed cost. So in summary, from a cost of production standpoint, extreme variation was seen regardless of system. And so again, management is more important in terms of production costs than type of system used. On all of our system, feed cost was roughly half the cost of production, which is consistent with other record-keeping systems. What we think is really important as well, though, is to look at that indirect ownership cost of cattle, equipment, and facilities. It's our second largest cost. It's not a cash cost, so it's often overlooked by producers, but it is very significant, and we need to pay ourselves back for that non-cash cost over time. All three of the systems that we looked at have the potential to be low-cost operations, and when we looked at our low-cost one-third operations, we did have producers in there from every one of our three systems. And finally, we did see some potential economy of scale benefits from all three types of systems when we got into those herds that were in the 50 to 100 cow herd and above range. So our take-home message on this is that producers need to know their own actual cost of production and compare that against some industry benchmarks to really be able to set goals on controlling costs for their operation as they move into the future. If you'd like more information on this project, the full manual can be purchased from the ISU Extension store, or it can be downloaded online for free. There are a limited number of printed manuals available free thanks to our Leopold Center grant. Beyond that, then there will be a fee for the printed manual, but the online version will always be available free of charge. And if you have any additional questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I'm in Northeast Iowa at the Benton County Extension Office, or you can visit with any of our 6 field specialists if you have any questions in the future. I hope you watch some of the rest of our parts of this series and visit with us about any concerns you may have.